Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're heading straight into the fiery furnace that is COP29.
Oh yeah.
The UN Climate Summit, currently happening in Baku, Azerbaijan.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we're not just going to skim the surface here.
Right.
We're diving deep, deep, deep into climate finance and all the drama swirling around it at this pivotal summit.
Absolutely. And I think you're going to find it's even more dramatic than you think.
Oh, I'm sure I will. Okay, so to set the scene, I know you've probably seen those headlines about a controversial carbon market deal and Papua New Guinea's dramatic boycotts, right?
Yeah, pretty big news.
Those are just the tip of the iceberg, my friends. We're going to connect the dots and cover the real story behind them.
All right, let's do it.
So to get started, can you give us a quick rundown of what COP29 is all about?
Okay, so COP29, that's the 29th Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change.
Okay.
It's basically the big annual event where all the nations are supposed to get together and hash out a global plan.
To tackle climate change.
Okay.
But as you mentioned, there are some pretty serious issues that are popping up already.
Yeah, cracks might be putting it mildly. Papua New Guinea straight up called it a waste of time and refused to even participate. That's got to send a message, right?
Oh, absolutely. It really highlights the mounting frustration among a lot of these developing nations, particularly the ones that are literally on the front lines of climate change. You know? Imagine living in a place where rising sea levels and extreme weather are just everyday occurrences. And then the wealthy nations that promised financial support, they're nowhere to be found.
It makes you wonder if these summits are actually about solutions or just big, fancy PR stunts, you know?
That's a question a lot of people are asking. Especially considering that this COP is being funded by organizations linked to the ruling family in Azerbaijan, which is, of course, an oil-rich nation.
So it's hard not to be a little skeptical.
Oh, yeah, a little skeptical, especially when their entire economy is built on fossil fuels.
Exactly.
Speaking of which, let's unpack this carbon market drama that's unfolding at COP29.
Okay.
We're talking about Article 6.4, the one dealing with international carbon markets. It got pushed through with almost no debate, leading to accusations of, backroom deals and things like that. So can you break it down for us? What's actually happening with this?
So basically, Article 6.4 aims to create a system where countries and companies can offset their emissions by investing in projects that reduce emissions elsewhere.
Okay.
It's like a global emissions balancing act.
So instead of cutting their own emissions, they can kind of buy their way out of responsibility by funding projects in other countries.
That's the basic idea.
Doesn't that sound like a loophole to you?
Well, that's exactly what a lot of critics are saying. They're arguing that carbon markets just allow polluters to keep doing business as usual. And they're just shifting the burden of emissions reductions onto developing nations without addressing the root problem.
And I've seen some people are really worried about the impacts this could have on communities in the global south. One critic even said that it's opening the floodgates for a global carbon market that will have devastating impacts on communities in the global south.
It's a serious concern, and to really understand the gravity of it, we need to look at the data. There was a recent report from UNCTAD.
The UN Conference on Trade and Development.
Right, exactly.
Right?
And they found that in 2023, the value of carbon credits generated in least developed countries was just 1% of the total aid they received.
Wow.
So if these carbon markets were supposed to be this financial lifeline, they're falling incredibly short.
Yeah, that's a huge discrepancy. What about the process of adopting these standards for Article 6.4? Was there anything concerning about how that happened?
Yeah, actually, there are some serious procedural concerns. It seems like the supervisory body, which is the group responsible for developing these rules, they kind of bypassed the usual approval process.
Really?
Yeah, and that's raising a lot of questions about transparency and whether everyone was included in the process.
So they just went ahead and set the rules without input from all the countries involved?
Pretty much, yeah. Even the former chair of the supervisory body admitted that some rules were created on the fly.
Wow.
Which is pretty alarming when you think about how much these standards could impact global climate action.
It does seem a bit rushed and opaque, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like, whose interests are really being served here?
It's a valid question, and this lack of transparency just feeds into those broader critiques of Article 6.4 and the concerns that it might actually make existing inequalities worse rather than addressing them.
Okay, so let's get into those critiques. Can you lay out the specific concerns people have with these Article 6.4 standards?
Sure. One of the biggest concerns is just how complex the standards are. They have all these intricate requirements for things like setting baselines, demonstrating additionality, and dealing with things like leakage.
Okay, hold on. I think we need a little explain it like I'm 5 moment here.
Okay.
What do those terms actually mean in practice?
Okay, good point. Let's say you're a company and you want to offset your emissions by investing in, let's say, a wind farm project in a developing country.
Right.
The first thing you'd need to do is establish a baseline, which is basically a projection of what emissions from that region would be if the wind farm wasn't built.
Gotcha.
Then you have to prove that the project wouldn't happen at all without the financial incentive from carbon credits. That's what additionality means.
Okay.
And finally, you have to deal with the risk of leakage, which means making sure the project doesn't just end up shifting emissions to another location.
Gotcha. So it's about making sure that these carbon offsetting projects are really actually reducing emissions and not just shifting things around or creating like weird incentives.
Yeah.
Seems complicated.
It is complicated. And critics are worried that all these complexities, especially the requirements for proving additionality and addressing leakage, might actually prevent developing countries from participating in the carbon market.
So the countries that are supposed to benefit the most might get shut out because of all the red tape.
That's the worry.
Yeah.
And then there's the issue of suppressed demand. Imagine a community where people don't have basic things like electricity or clean water because of poverty or lack of infrastructure.
Sadly, that's the reality for a lot of communities.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And the problem is that the Article 6.4 standards don't give clear guidance on how to account for this suppressed demand when they're calculating baselines and emission reductions.
So projects could get credit for emissions reductions that would have happened anyway as these communities develop and get their needs met.
Exactly.
That doesn't seem fair or accurate.
Yeah, not at all. And it undermines the goal of promoting sustainable development along with emission reductions.
Right. It feels like we're just getting deeper and deeper into this web of complexities.
Yeah.
What other red flags are people raising about these standards?
Another big one is the potential for double counting of emission reductions.
Okay.
So let's say you have a project in a developing country that's already part of that country's national climate plan.
So they're already working on reducing emissions domestically.
Right. But the standards don't clearly explain how to make sure that the emissions reductions from that project aren't counted twice. Once domestically and again internationally through the carbon market.
So it could lead to inflated claims about global emission reductions.
Exactly.
Which would undermine the whole climate action effort.
Exactly.
What about the risk of leakage? You mentioned that before.
Yeah, leakage is a major concern. Critics argue that even though the standards mention some strategies to address it, they don't have clear procedures, and they don't really take into account how difficult it is to accurately measure leakage in many cases.
So a project could claim to be offsetting emissions, but those emissions are just being shifted somewhere else.
Right. It's like squeezing a balloon. The air just goes somewhere else.
Yeah, good analogy. So it seems like these standards have a lot of potential loopholes and complexities that could undermine their effectiveness and maybe even worsen existing inequalities.
That's what a lot of critics are saying.
Yeah.
They think we need a more cautious and nuanced approach that focuses on actually reducing emissions rather than risky offsetting schemes.
Okay, so clearly Article 6.4 is not a perfect solution.
Definitely not.
And it's really important to understand these criticisms before we jump headfirst into a global carbon market.
Absolutely.
That could have some pretty serious unintended consequences.
Right.
So I think it's time to shift our focus to the voices that often get overlooked in these discussions, particularly indigenous communities, who are on the front lines of both climate change and poorly designed climate solutions.
Absolutely.
Now, speaking marginalized voices, there was a really powerful statement at COP28 by the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change Caucus.
Yeah, they make some really important points.
They argued that these carbon markets, along with things like geoengineering and nature-based solutions, can actually lead to new forms of colonization, militarization, criminalization, and land loss for indigenous peoples.
Serious issue.
And they called for a moratorium on these activities until there are proper safeguards in place to protect indigenous rights and sovereignty.
It's essential.
Their statement is a stark reminder that climate action shouldn't come at the cost of human rights.
Absolutely.
And that any solutions we implement need to be equitable and just for everyone.
Yeah.
It really makes you think, are we, in the name of climate action, actually perpetuating the systems of oppression that caused the climate crisis in the first place?
It's a question we need to be asking ourselves.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive.
We have.
We've got this controversial carbon market deal being pushed through a Pacific nation boycotting the summit.
Yeah.
And some serious doubts about whether these complex mechanisms will actually deliver climate justice.
It's complicated.
It is complicated.
And often disheartening.
Yeah.
But we're not done yet. In the next part of our deep dive, we're going to look at some alternative approaches to climate finance and examine whether the whole COP process might be failing to deliver on its promises.
All right.
And we'll also delve into the world of climate finance negotiations.
Sounds good. I'm ready for part 2.
All right, let's do it.
Okay. Welcome back, deep divers.
Yeah.
That carbon market discussion was a lot to take in.
It really was.
Still trying to wrap my head around it all.
Yeah, it's a lot of moving pieces, that's for sure.
But one thing that really stuck with me was this idea of permanence when it comes to carbon offsets. Like, how do we know that the emissions reductions we're counting on aren't just going to be reversed in the future?
Yeah, that's a huge issue, and it's especially tricky for projects involving carbon removals.
Right, like planting trees.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, even if we plant millions of trees today, who's to say those trees will still be standing 100 years from now?
Exactly, yeah.
There are wildfires, deforestation, diseases, all sorts of threats that could just wipe out those carbon sinks and release all those emissions back into the atmosphere.
It's like we're playing a long game of climate roulette.
Right.
Hoping those emissions stay locked away.
Yeah, exactly. So are there any, viable alternatives to these carbon markets?
Well, one idea that's gaining some traction is the concept of a green climate fund.
Okay.
So instead of relying on market-based approaches like offsets, this would be a more direct form of financial assistance from developed countries to developing countries, specifically for climate mitigation and adaptation projects.
So it's more about recognizing the historical responsibility of developed nations.
Right.
And just providing direct support.
Exactly. It's rooted in the principle of climate justice. Recognizing that those who contributed the least to the problem are often the ones facing the most severe consequences.
Okay, it sounds good in theory, but I'm guessing there are challenges with this approach too.
Oh, absolutely. One of the biggest hurdles is getting developed countries to actually commit to providing enough funding.
Makes sense.
The initial goal was to mobilize $100 billion a year by 2020, but they've consistently missed that target.
Yeah, I've heard about that.
And as the impacts of climate change get worse, the financial needs of developing countries are only going to increase.
It seems like it all boils down to political will, Will wealthy nations actually step up and put their money where their mouth is?
It's a big question.
Yeah, and beyond just the funding itself, how do we ensure that the money is actually used effectively?
That's another big challenge, yeah. There are a lot of questions about how to allocate the funds, how to ensure transparency, accountability.
Right. We need to make sure the money is reaching the communities who need it most.
Absolutely.
And not getting lost in bureaucracy or diverted to projects that don't actually benefit those on the front lines.
Absolutely.
It's a lot to think about.
Yeah, it really is.
I think we need a moment to step back and distill some of these key takeaways.
Okay, good idea.
So for our listeners, what are the big things we want them to remember about climate finance?
I think the first and most important takeaway is that climate finance is absolutely essential.
Yeah.
Developing countries simply can't make the investments they need to without financial support from wealthier nations.
It's about global solidarity and justice.
Absolutely.
Those who benefited the most from the activities that caused climate change have a moral obligation to support those who are bearing the brunt of the consequences.
100%.
Okay, so that's the first takeaway.
Yeah.
What's the second?
The second is that there's a lot of debate about how that finance should be provided.
Right.
Carbon markets are one option, but as we've seen, they're really controversial and come with a lot of risks.
Yeah.
The Green Climate Fund is a more direct approach.
Right.
But getting developed nations to actually pony up the cash is a huge challenge.
So it's not just about the amount of money.
Right.
It's also about the mechanisms and the power dynamics involved.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Who gets to control the money?
Right.
Who decides which projects get funded?
Yeah, those are all huge questions.
Absolutely.
And the third takeaway?
This debate is far from over.
Right.
COP29 is just one chapter in a long and ongoing story.
Right.
The outcome of these negotiations will have major implications for the future of climate action.
Yeah.
So it's vital that we all stay informed and engaged.
So this isn't just a spectator sport. Our listeners have a role to play.
Absolutely.
But what can they do?
That's a good question. Well, first off, knowledge is power.
Right.
The more we know about this stuff, the better we can hold our leaders accountable.
Yeah.
So keep learning, keep asking questions, stay engaged with the issues.
Follow the news, read in-depth reports, explore the resources online.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of public pressure.
Yeah.
Call your representatives, sign petitions, join protests, make your voices heard.
The more people demand climate justice, the harder it will be to ignore us.
Exactly. It's about shifting the narrative.
Yeah.
Making it clear that climate action isn't just an environmental issue, but a social justice issue, an economic justice issue, a human rights issue.
Right. It's all connected.
Absolutely. And beyond the political stuff, there are things we can do in our own lives to reduce our impact and support a more sustainable future.
Right, like reducing our energy consumption, choosing sustainable transportation.
Yeah.
Supporting businesses that are committed to environmental responsibility.
Right.
Every little bit counts.
It can feel overwhelming.
Definitely.
But we don't have to be perfect.
Right.
Just engaged.
Yeah, and it's not about deprivation and sacrifice. Yeah. It's about creating a better world.
For ourselves and future generations.
Absolutely. A more just and sustainable future where everyone can thrive.
Okay, so I feel like we've gone pretty deep into climate finance.
We have.
But there's always more to explore.
Oh, yeah. Definitely. And that's what's exciting about this. This is an ongoing conversation. Okay. And the more we learn, the better equipped we are to push for real change.
So in the last part of our deep dive, we're going to zoom in on some specific issues at play at COP29 and take a look at the growing feeling that these summits just might not be fit for purpose.
It's a valid concern.
And we'll explore what a more effective approach to global climate governance might look like.
Sounds good. Okay, deep divers, stay with us. Welcome back, deep divers. As we wrap up our exploration of COP29, I gotta say, it's a real roller coaster of emotions.
Yeah, definitely a mixed bag.
We've seen some signs of progress, but also a lot of political maneuvering and resistance to real change.
It's like walking through a maze, you know?
Right.
Glimmers of light at the end, but lots of dead ends and wrong turns along the way.
And the clock is ticking. It makes me wonder if these COP summits with all the world leaders and negotiators, are they really the best way to tackle this crisis? Are they actually fit for purpose?
That's the question everyone's asking, especially after that open letter we talked about earlier.
Right, the one signed by Ban Ki-moon and Christiana Figueres.
Exactly.
It was pretty startling to see those big names expressing such serious doubts about the effectiveness of these summits.
Yeah, their critique gets right to the heart of it. They argue that the way it's structured now, with the focus on consensus and voluntary commitments, it just doesn't have the power to deliver the kind of rapid and transformative action we need.
So it's not just about tweaking the rules or finding better ways to finance climate action.
Right.
It's about questioning the whole framework of how we're governing this global issue.
Exactly. And their call for reform is being echoed by a lot of activists and civil society groups who are getting increasingly frustrated with the slow pace of change.
Yeah, I get that.
And the lack of accountability within the COP process.
When you look at how big this crisis is and how urgently we need to act, watching these negotiations drag on year after year with minimal results, it's like, come on.
It's like fiddling while Rome burns, right?
Exactly. And it's not just the slow pace, it's also the influence of powerful special interests.
Oh, for sure.
Like all the fossil fuel lobbyists at COP29, that's been pretty controversial.
It's like the fox guarding the hen house.
And this COP is happening in Azerbaijan.
Yeah.
An oil-rich nation.
A petrostate.
It's hard to imagine real progress on phasing out fossil fuels when the host country has so much to lose from that.
That's a major point. And it ties back into Papua New Guinea's boycott, too.
Right.
They pulled out not just because of the climate finance issue, but because they felt like the whole process was rigged against them.
Like their voices weren't being heard.
Exactly.
That their concerns were being ignored.
It's a powerful symbol of that growing divide between the countries most vulnerable to climate change and the ones with all the power to actually do something about it.
So what does this mean for the future of climate action? If the processes designed to address the crisis are themselves in crisis,
right,
where do we go from here?
That's the big question, right? The current system isn't working well enough.
Yeah.
We need bolder action, more accountability, and a fundamental shift in who has the power.
And we need it now. We're way past the time for incremental change.
Totally agree.
We need a total transformation in how we relate to the planet. One that recognizes that we're all connected, and prioritizes the well-being of future generations.
That's a beautiful vision, and I think we can get there if we work together.
Yeah.
And I actually see signs of that transformation already happening.
Where?
Look at the youth climate movement. Young people are demanding action with such energy and clarity.
They're not waiting around for permission.
Nope. They're taking to the streets, organizing online, holding our leaders accountable in ways that are really inspiring.
And it's not just young people.
Right.
There's a growing awareness of how climate change connects to social justice.
Absolutely.
Economic inequality.
As all interconnect.
People are realizing that these issues can't be separated.
Yeah.
If we want to solve one, we have to address them all.
Exactly, and that's creating some powerful alliances.
Yeah.
Indigenous communities are leading the fight for climate justice. Communities of color are demanding environmental justice.
Right.
Labor unions are pushing for a just transition to a green economy.
It's amazing to see so many people coming together.
It really is. And let's not forget about all the advancements in renewable energy and sustainable technologies.
Oh, yeah.
The cost of solar and wind has dropped dramatically.
Yeah.
Electric vehicles are becoming more common.
Right.
Battery tech is getting better all the time.
So we have the solutions, the technology, the public will. We just need the political courage to make it happen.
That's the key ingredient, and that's where our listeners come in.
Right. We all have a role to play.
Every action we take, every conversation, every choice, it all contributes.
You can support sustainable businesses.
Yes.
Invest in renewable energy, reduce our consumption.
Absolutely.
Advocate for better policies.
We can amplify the voices of those most affected by climate change.
Right.
Challenge the narratives of denial and delay. Demand a future where people and the planet come before profit.
It's a lot, but each small actions can make a difference when we all do them together.
Exactly. And don't lose hope. Hope isn't passive. It's what drives us to action.
It's the belief that a better world is possible.
Yes.
And the commitment to make it happen.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into COP29 and climate finance.
It's been a journey, for sure.
A lot to think about.
Lots to think about, but also hopefully some inspiration.
It's been an honor to explore this with you and all our listeners.
The future is still being written, and we all have a hand in shaping it.
So stay curious, stay engaged, and stay hopeful.
Thanks for listening, everyone.